Human soldier Carl Griffin crouched low behind the rubble, watching helplessly as the alien girl stumbled and fell, Kragan soldiers closing in with vicious snarls and drawn weapons. No other humans or Deltans were coming to save her. He was her only hope. The once thriving planet Zephyrus had been reduced to a hellscape of bombed-out cities and ashen wastelands. The peaceful Deltan people were outmatched and overwhelmed, their defenses crumbling under the ruthless Kragan onslaught. Taurus, a young Deltan girl, had been separated from her family in the chaos of an evacuation gone wrong. She ran blindly through the ruined streets, heart pounding, lungs burning, desperately searching for shelter. But the Kragan were hot on her tail, determined to capture any stragglers for their sadistic experiments. Taurus tripped on a chunk of concrete, crying out as she scraped her knee. The guttural shouts of the Kragan grew louder. They had heard her. They were coming. Carl readied his plasma rifle with grim determination. He was part of a small unit of human peacekeepers, sent to aid the Deltans in their darkest hour. But his squad mates were gone, killed or captured in an earlier ambush. He was alone, the fate of this innocent child resting solely on his shoulders. He wouldn't let the Kragan take her, not while he still drew breath. Carl caught Taurus's eye, signaling for her to take cover behind a collapsed wall. The Kragan voices grew closer, echoing off the ruined buildings. Carl took aim, prepared to fight to the death to save this one small life in a galaxy consumed by war. It was the human thing to do. Carl squeezed the trigger of his plasma rifle, sending burst after burst of searing light at the approaching Kragan. Ozone filled his nose and mouth, the air tasting acrid and metallic. The Kragan roared as they returned fire. Bolts streaked past Carl's head as he ducked behind a chunk of rubble. He peeked out and fired again. 1, 2, 3 Kragan fell, holes burned clean through. But there were too many. He was one man against a whole patrol. Carl rolled, barely dodging a barrage of plasma. Sweat stung his eyes. His rifle hissed, glowing red-hot. From the corner of his eye, he saw Taurus crouched behind the wall, eyes wide with terror. He had to get her out of here, had to keep her safe. Carl gritted his teeth and kept firing, thinning the Kragan ranks. For a moment, it seemed he would win the day. Then a second patrol stormed from a side street, drawn by the sounds of battle. Carl's heart sank. He couldn't fight them all, not alone. Plasma rained down, chewing up the ground. Carl reached a decision. He lunged from cover, snatching Taurus into his arms. She yelped in surprise. With the girl clinging to his neck, Carl ran, zigzagging through the rubble. A bolt sizzled past his ear. Another struck the ground near his feet. He jinked left, then right, making for an abandoned building. Taurus buried her face in his shoulder as he traded shots with the Kragan. At the door, Carl turned and fired one last burst. Then he barreled inside, just as a volley of plasma reduced the entrance to molten slag. The building shuddered, groaning like a dying beast. Dust and debris rained down, pattering off Carl's helmet. He set Taurus down, looking desperately for an exit. There was none. They were trapped, with the Kragan closing in. It was only a matter of time. Carl's mind raced, searching for a solution, but he was coming up blank. Time was running out and he had a child to protect, a child he had sworn to save. He checked his rifle's charge. Not enough for a sustained fight. He'd have to make every shot count. From outside came the guttural barks of Kragan voices. They had the building surrounded. Carl met Taurus's terrified gaze, forcing a smile he didn't feel. He had to stay strong for her, had to keep her spirits up, even if he didn't see a way out. "Don't worry," he said, "I'll keep you safe, no matter what." Taurus nodded, lower lip trembling. She believed him, trusted him. Carl scanned the shadowy interior of the crumbling building, searching for any means of escape. The Kragan's guttural shouts echoed from outside, drawing ever closer. Taurus whimpered softly, clinging to his leg. Time was running out. Then he saw it, a narrow crack in the far wall, partially hidden by debris. Carl hurried over, pulling away chunks of rubble to reveal a dark, yawning passage. An underground tunnel, perhaps from an older era of Zephyrus's history. It was their only chance. The girl hesitated, eyeing the black depths with trepidation. But a particularly loud kragan roar from outside jolted her into action. She nodded, squeezing Carl's hand tight. Together they stepped into the tunnel. Carl paused just long enough to fire a plasma bolt at the tunnel entrance. The shot struck true, collapsing the opening in a shower of molten rock and metal. It wouldn't hold the kragan for long, but it might buy them some precious time. The tunnel was narrow and winding, the air thick with the stench of age and decay. Carl activated his wrist-mounted light, casting a dim, eerie glow over the cracked walls and uneven floor. Taurus stayed close, her small frame trembling against his side. As they delved deeper, strange noises began to echo from the shadows, skittering, scratching sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Carl's combat instinct screamed danger, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. But he pressed on, his jaw clenched with grim determination. Turning back was not an option. Suddenly the ground beneath their feet gave way with a sickening lurch. Carl barely had time to react before they were falling, tumbling down a steep incline into inky blackness. He twisted his body mid-fall, wrapping himself around Taurus to shield her from the impact. They hit the ground hard. The breath knocked from Carl's lungs in a painful rush. For a moment he lay there, dazed and disoriented. His head throbbed, his vision swimming. Beside him Taurus stirred with a soft groan. Carl forced himself to move, to sit up and assess their surroundings. They were in a vast subterranean chamber, the walls lined with rows upon rows of stasis pods. A sickly green light emanated from each pod, illuminating the horrific contents within. Deltans in various stages of grotesque mutation, their bodies twisted and warped by the kragan's vile experiments. Carl's stomach lurched at the sight, bile rising in his throat. But it was the figure in the center of the chamber that made his blood run cold. A towering kragan clad in the dark robes of a scientist, flanked by a squad of heavily armed guards. The kragan's eyes glittered with cruel intelligence as they fixed upon Carl and Taurus. "Well, well," the scientist said, his voice a guttural rasp. "What have we here? A lost little lamb and his precious cargo." Carl reached for his plasma rifle, only to find it gone, lost in the fall. He shifted into a crouch, pushing Taurus behind him. His mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. But there was none. They were trapped, at the heart of the enemy's operation. And now, there may be no escape. Dr. Zolox loomed over Carl and Taurus, his eyes glinting with malevolent curiosity. The kragan scientist's scarred face twisted into a grotesque approximation of a smile as he spoke, his words rendered in chilling, mechanical tones by the translator at his collar. "A human soldier and a young Deltan, how interesting," he rasped. "You will make excellent additions to my experiments." Carl's heart raced as he stepped in front of Taurus, shielding the trembling girl from the kragan's predatory gaze. He knew they were outmatched and outgunned, trapped in the heart of the enemy's stronghold with no backup and no escape. But he refused to let the alien scientist lay a single claw on Taurus, not while he still drew breath. Carl's eyes darted around the chamber, desperately searching for anything that could give them an edge. Then he saw it, a control panel nestled against the far wall, its surface covered in blinking lights and strange, alien symbols. A desperate plan began to take shape in his mind. He leaned down, his lips brushing Taurus's ear as he whispered urgently, "When I give the signal, run for that side tunnel over there. Don't look back, no matter what you hear. Understand?" Taurus nodded, her small hands balling into fists at her sides. Carl squeezed her shoulder reassuringly, then turned to face Dr. Zolox and his guards. "You're not taking us alive," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Not without a fight." Carl tensed, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, he lunged for the control panel, his fingers scrabbling frantically across the alien controls. "Stop him!" Dr. Zolox roared, his eyes widening in alarm. "Don't let him touch that panel!" The kragan guards opened fire, filling the air with the sizzling hiss of plasma bolts. Carl ducked and weaved, his heart pounding in his chest as he input the final command sequence. Just as his finger hit the last button, a bolt of plasma grazed his shoulder, searing through his armor, and sending him spinning to the ground with a cry of pain. Alarms blared throughout the chamber, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. With a hiss of pressurized gas, the stasis pods along the walls began to open, disgorging their horrific contents. The mutated Deltans, their bodies twisted and deformed by the Kragan's vile experiments, stumbled from their pods, their eyes blazing with pain and rage. They fell upon the Kragan guards with terrifying ferocity, ripping and tearing with claws and teeth. In the chaos, Carl staggered to his feet, his injured arm hanging limply at his side. "Taurus, run!" he shouted, giving the girl a desperate shove towards the side tunnel. "Go now!" Carl limped after her, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he clutched his wounded shoulder. Behind him the sounds of screams and plasma fire echoed through the chamber, a nightmarish cacophony of violence and death. But as they raced down the tunnel, Carl's heart sank. The passage ended abruptly in a small, dimly lit chamber, its walls lined with pulsating organic sacs. From the shadows, a swarm of insectoid creatures emerged, their chitinous bodies glistening wetly in the light. Carl pushed Taurus behind him, his eyes wide with horror as he realized the true extent of the Kragan's twisted experiments. The creatures skittered forward, their mandibles clicking hungrily, and Carl knew that they had escaped one nightmare only to stumble into another. The creatures swarmed towards them, their many legs skittering against the metal floor. Carl backed away, shielding Taurus with his body, as his mind raced desperately for a solution. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. They were trapped, at the mercy of these nightmarish abominations. As the insectoid horrors closed in, their drooling jaws snapping in anticipation, Carl could only pray that his desperate gambit had bought Taurus enough time to escape, even if it cost him his own life in the process. In a last desperate gamble, Carl reached into his utility pouch and withdrew a handful of plasma grenades, the last of his arsenal. He locked eyes with Taurus, his voice urgent but steady. "When I say run, you run. Understand?" Taurus nodded, her face pale but determined. Carl primed the grenades, their activation lights blinking red. With a roar, he lobbed them at the creatures, aiming for the support beams of the tunnel. The grenades detonated with a blinding flash and a deafening boom. The force of the blast sent Carl and Taurus flying, the shockwave slamming them against the tunnel wall. The world spun, Carl's ears ringing. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog. Beside him, Taurus stirred with a groan. The tunnel shuddered and collapsed, tons of rubble crashing down, crushing the insectoid horrors beneath. Dust billowed, choking the air. Carl staggered to his feet, pulling Taurus up with him. They were bruised and battered, but alive. The tunnel had collapsed, sealing off the way they'd come. But as the dust settled, Carl realized they were in a different section of the underground complex, one that seemed older, more ancient. Strange symbols glowed on the walls, pulsing with an eerie blue light. Taurus gasped, her eyes wide with recognition. "The ancient language of my people," she whispered, her voice trembling with awe and fear. "I've seen these symbols before, in the ruins near my village." Before Carl could respond, a hidden door in the wall slid open with a hiss of stale air. Beyond lay a chamber bathed in a soft, ethereal light. In the center of the chamber stood a towering machine, its surface etched with more of the glowing symbols. It hummed with power, an almost tangible aura emanating from its core. Cautiously, Carl and Taurus approached the machine. As they drew near, it came to life, projecting a shimmering hologram of a Deltan elder. The elder's face was lined with age and sorrow, his eyes haunted by a deep, unspoken grief. "If you are seeing this," the elder spoke, his voice echoing with wisdom and pain, "then our worst fears have come to pass. The Kragan have returned, and our people are in grave danger." Carl's heart clenched at the confirmation of what he already knew. The Kragan's cruelty knew no bounds. "But there is still hope," the elder continued, his gaze seeming to pierce through Carl. "Within this machine lies the key to our salvation, a weapon capable of turning the tide of war. But to wield it, you must first prove yourself worthy." The hologram flickered and faded. leaving Carl and Taurus alone in the chamber. The weight of the elder's words hung heavy in the air, a burden and a promise. Carl looked at Taurus, seeing the same mix of fear and determination in her eyes that he felt in his own heart. Carl and Taurus stepped up to the alien machine, its surfaces adorned with intricate symbols that glowed and pulsed with an inner light. Taurus's eyes went wide as she took in the ancient glyphs, a spark of recognition igniting in her gaze. She reached out with a trembling hand, her small fingers tracing the air above the symbols. I think I can read this," she whispered, her voice filled with a mix of awe and trepidation. Carl watched as Taurus began to decipher the glyphs, her brow furrowed in concentration. Despite the dire situation they found themselves in, he couldn't help but feel a swell of admiration for the young girl's bravery and intelligence. She was so young, yet she carried herself with a strength and determination that belied her years. As Taurus worked, a low rumble began to echo through the chamber, growing louder and more intense with each passing second. Dust rained down from the ceiling as the walls began to shake, and Carl felt a cold knot of dread form in the pit of his stomach. Taurus nodded, her fingers flying over the glyphs with renewed urgency. The rumble grew to a deafening roar, and Carl could hear the unmistakable sound of Kragan voices shouting in the distance. Just as the first Kragan soldier burst through the chamber's entrance, his weapon raised and ready to fire, Taurus's hand slammed down on the final glyph. The machine hummed to life, its panels sliding open to reveal a small crystalline device nestled within. Taurus reached for the device but hesitated at the last moment, her hand hovering uncertainly over the glowing crystal. Carl saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes, and he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I can do this," he said, his voice steady and calm despite the chaos erupting around them. "I believe in you." Taurus met his gaze, and Carl saw the fear in her eyes melt away, replaced by a steely resolve. She nodded once, then reached out and closed her fingers around the device. When the light finally faded, Carl blinked away the spots dancing in his vision, and found himself standing in a strange, ethereal realm. Gone were the crumbling walls and dusty floors of the underground chamber. In their place was a vast expanse of swirling mist and shimmering light. Beside him Taurus gasped, her eyes wide with wonder. Before them stood the ghostly figure of a Deltan elder, his form translucent and shimmering. The elder's eyes were filled with a deep sadness, but also with a glimmer of hope. "To wield the weapon," the elder said, his voice echoing in the stillness, "you must first understand its power and the price that comes with it." Carl and Taurus exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They had come this far, had fought and bled and nearly died to reach this moment. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The elder raised his hand, and the mist began to swirl faster, coalescing into a shimmering portal. Through the portal, Carl could see glimpses of the past, of the war that had ravaged Zephyrus, and the horrors the Kragan had inflicted upon the Deltan people. "Step through," the elder intoned, his voice heavy with the weight of centuries, "and witness the truth of what has been and what is yet to come." Carl took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever lay on the other side. He reached out and took Taurus's hand, feeling the small, warm weight of her fingers in his own. Together they stepped through the portal and into the unknown. The ethereal realm shifted and twisted, the shimmering light fading into a dark, nightmarish landscape. Shadows loomed on all sides, their edges jagged and distorted. An unnatural chill hung in the air, seeping into Taurus's bones and making her shiver. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, Taurus realized with a start that the figures surrounding her were not strangers, but her own people. Deltans, their faces and forms warped into something sinister and malevolent. Their eyes glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light, fixing upon her with a hunger that made her skin crawl. "You are weak," they whispered, their voices blending into a discordant chorus that echoed in the darkness. "You will never be strong enough to save us. You are nothing but a frightened child, playing at being a hero." Taurus felt hot tears sting her eyes as the weight of their words crashed over her. She turned, desperate to find Carl, to draw strength from his steady presence. But he was gone, vanished into the shadows, leaving her alone to face the demons of her own doubt and fear. The shadowy figures pressed closer, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. Taurus could feel their malice, their hunger, as if they sought to devour her very soul. She wanted to run, to hide, to curl up into a ball and let the darkness take her. But then, as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Taurus felt the weight of the crystalline device in her hand. It pulsed with a faint warmth, a glimmer of hope in the suffocating gloom. The elder's words echoed in her mind, a reminder of the power that lay within her, waiting to be unleashed. With a trembling hand, Taurus raised the device aloft. It began to glow, a brilliant white light that pierced the darkness like a beacon. The shadowy figures recoiled, hissing in pain and fear as the light seared their twisted forms. The device responded to her words, its light growing brighter and brighter until it was almost blinding. The shadows screamed and writhed, their forms dissolving in the searing radiance. Taurus could feel the power of the device thrumming through her, a wild, exhilarating rush that made her feel invincible. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The light faded, and Taurus found herself back in the chamber, the device pulsing with barely contained energy in her hand. Carl stood beside her, his eyes wide with awe and wonder. But there was no time to celebrate. The Kragan, momentarily stunned by the blinding light, were recovering, their weapons raised and ready to fire. Taurus could see the hatred and fear in their eyes, the realization that they faced not just a child, but a force to be reckoned with. Taurus stepped forward, her fear now replaced by a fierce, unshakable determination. She could feel the power of the device coursing through her, a wild, untamed energy that begged to be unleashed. She met the Kragan's gaze with a steely resolve, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. For she knew with a certainty that went beyond mere hope or belief that she held the key to her people's salvation in her hands, and she would not rest until the Kragan were driven from her world and her people were free once more. Taurus raised the crystalline device, feeling its energy pulsing through her veins like liquid fire. She focused her will, channeling the power towards the Kragan soldiers. A blinding beam of light erupted from the device, streaking towards the enemy with incredible speed. But at the last moment the beam swerved, missing the soldiers and instead striking the chamber's walls. The ancient stone cracked and crumbled, chunks of rock raining down from the ceiling. "Look out!" Carl shouted, grabbing Taurus's hand and yanking her towards the exit. They ran, dodging falling debris and plasma bolts as the Kragan gave chase. The chamber behind them imploded with a deafening roar, burying the ancient machine and the pursuing soldiers beneath tons of rubble. Carl and Taurus burst out of the underground complex, battered and exhausted but alive. They stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath, the weight of their ordeal hanging heavy upon them. Taurus looked down at the device in her shaking hands, now dark and dormant. A wave of failure washed over her. She hadn't been able to control the weapon's power. She'd let everyone down. Taurus nodded, blinking back tears. She wanted to believe him, but the doubt gnawing at her heart was hard to ignore. Suddenly a shadow fell over them. They looked up to see a massive Kragan warship descending from the sky, its weapons trained on their position. Carl and Taurus's eyes widened with fear. Their battle was far from over. The warship's hatch hissed open, revealing the scarred, leering face of Dr. Zolox. His eyes gleamed with malice as he sneered down at them. "You may have escaped my laboratory," he hissed, "but you cannot escape your fate. Surrender the device, and your deaths will be quick and painless." Carl and Taurus exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They couldn't give up, not with the fate of the Deltan people hanging in the balance. They rose to their feet, bruised and bloodied but unbroken. They would face whatever horrors the Kragan had in store, united in their determination to fight until the very end. Plasma cannons thrummed to life along the warship's hull, glowing with deadly energy. Dr. Zolox smiled, a cruel, twisted expression that sent chills down Taurus's spine. "So be it," he rasped. "If you will not surrender, then you will be destroyed." He raised a clawed hand, preparing to give the order to fire. Taurus's heart raced, her grip tightening on the dormant device. Was this how it would end? Cut down on the barren wastes of her own world, with her people's last hope lost forever? Carl tensed beside her, his jaw clenched with grim resolve. He had no weapons, no plan, but he would not let Taurus face this alone. The air crackled with tension, the moment stretching out like a wire about to snap. Dr. Zolox's lips curled back from his fangs, a single word forming on his tongue. "Fire!" Dr. Zolox lunged at Carl, the jagged metal shard flashing in the eerie light. Carl dodged, but the Kragan's strength was fueled by a manic desperation. They grappled, rolling across the scorched earth, kicking up clouds of ash. Taurus gripped the crystalline device, her hands shaking. She circled the struggling pair, trying to line up a clean shot, but they were a blur of flailing limbs and gnashing teeth, locked in a primal battle for survival. Carl's muscles burned with fatigue, his wounds screaming in agony. Dr. Zolox seemed to feel no pain, his eyes wide and feverish. He bore down on Carl, the metal shard inching closer to the human's throat. Taurus's heart raced. She couldn't risk hitting Carl, but if she didn't act soon, Dr. Zolox would surely kill him. The seconds stretched into an eternity as she wavered, paralyzed by indecision. With a sudden burst of strength, Dr. Zolox wrenched the shard free and slammed Carl to the ground. He raised the jagged metal high, poised to plunge it into Carl's chest. Taurus's eyes widened. There was no more time for hesitation. She leaped forward, bringing the device down on Dr. Zolox's back with all her might. The crystal shattered on impact, a blinding light erupting from within. Dr. Zolox screamed, his body convulsing as the energy ripped through him. His flesh blackened and crumbled, his bones turning to dust. In moments, there was nothing left of the Kragan scientist but a pile of greasy ash scattering in the wind. Carl staggered to his feet, his chest heaving. He looked at Taurus, a mix of gratitude and sorrow in his eyes. She had saved his life, but at what cost? Taurus stared at the shattered remains of the device, tears carving tracks through the grime on her face. Without it, what chance did her people have against the Kragan? But as she met Carl's gaze, a flicker of hope kindled in her heart. Maybe their salvation didn't lie in ancient relics or forgotten technology. Maybe it resided in something simpler, yet infinitely more powerful, the unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of shared struggle. Carl reached out, clasping Taurus's small hand in his own. Together they turned to face the horizon, where the distant thunder of battle still rumbled. Their fight was far from over. More challenges and heartaches surely lay ahead, but they would face them side by side, united by a friendship that transcended the barriers of species and culture. As they set off into the unknown, Carl and Taurus carried the memories of the fallen and the fragile hope for a better tomorrow. It was a slim hope, a flickering candle flame in the darkness. But it was enough to light their way forward, one step at a time, into the gathering shadows of an uncertain future. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.